Okay, so Councillor Sanderson.
You need to declare.
Yeah, hang on, I just want to get a read of how many others are. Councillor Everard's president of, yeah,
But we don't declare it,
okay, okay. So what was that?
10.1.2,
Yeah,
0.5.
yeah,
10.5.2.
yeah. Mhm. And what's the is that on the basis of you being on the board of an organisation?
Football Queensland Wide Bay.
Yep. Okay. Yep. Okay, and Councillor Sanderson? What's your organisation?
Maryborough City Church.
Yep. So very similar to Councillor
Yes.
Madden's. Are there any further? So that's 3 people declaring on this one. Okay, can I do them all at once?
They each need to declare
Yeah.
their interest in accordance with legislation.
Yeah.
So Anne's
Anne
declared
has.
hers.
Yeah. Councillor Sanderson.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So in accordance with legislation, I'll declare that I've got a perceived conflict. I'm a member of the board of Maryborough City Church, and they may receive a benefit from this policy. My wife also is a member of the church and also works at Bayside Transformations, which is a not-for-profit organisation which may also receive a benefit from this policy. So, as said, I don't believe in last meeting that this affects my role within the community to make a decision here, and I declare that I'd like to stay in the room and vote on this matter.
Councillor Taylor.
Mr Mayor, I also declare a perceived conflict of interest in relation to this the same matter, item 10.5.2. It is perceived conflict as I'm a board member of Football Queensland Wide Bay, and I understand the other councillors have made a decision to stay in the room. Each person acts on their own view on these things, so I'll be leaving the room and not voting on the matter.
Yep. Okay. I move that Councillor, and so I can do this as one, I don't need a two. Yeah, that Councillor Maddern has a perceived conflict of interest in relation to agenda item 10.5.1, and that Councillor Maddern may participate, discuss and vote on agenda item 10.5.1, notwithstanding there is a perceived conflict of interest. Is everybody happy for me to do it that way? I'm just aware that some people voted last time that there wasn't a perceived conflict of interest. Yeah. Okay. All right. So you understand what I'm moving, that there's perceived conflict of interest, but she can stay in the room. Is there a seconder for that? Councillor Hanson, put the motion. All in favour? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sorry, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's carried. Yeah. I move that Councillor Sanderson has a perceived conflict of interest in agenda item 10.5.1 and may participate, discuss and vote on agenda item 10.5.1, notwithstanding there is a perceived conflict of interest. Is there a seconder? Councillor O'Keefe, I'll put the motion. All in favour? That's carried unanimously, 7-0. Are there any further? And we've minuted that Councillor Taylor is leaving the room on the line. Yep. Councillor Lewis.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Look, I declare that I may have a perceived conflict of interest in relation to item 16.2.1, it's a confidential item in relation to the Hervey Bay Administration Centre. The nature of my interest is that my wife, Susan Ann Lewis, and our family trust, the Lewis Family Trust, hold shares in a company, Lakeside Law Proprietary Limited, which owns a commercial unit within the Pialba CBD precinct. I've determined that this personal interest is not of sufficient significance that it will lead me to make a decision on the matter contrary to the public interest, and I will best perform my responsibility of serving the overall public interest by participation in the discussion and voting on the matter. I have raised this matter before when this issue's come up. The basis for my assessment of that is that the particular commercial unit is on the very fringes of the Pyalba CBD precinct. It's a developed parcel of land. The matters we're considering are remote from it and not likely to have any bearing on it. And I'm also conscious of the decision of the tribunal in relation to the matter in Tin Can Bay, and on that basis, I think it's consistent with the tribunal's view of this that I be permitted to participate. Just for the sake of completeness, I will also mention that on a previous occasion when this subject matter came before council, I declared another conflict and I left the room. That conflict related to a parcel of land in which a former client of mine had an interest. That parcel of land is no longer relevant to the matters under consideration, so I'm only simply mentioning that so that it's not thought that I've forgotten it. It's just no longer relevant. Thank you.
Just to clarify before I move a motion, your land and any land you have an interest in isn't in the tender process. It's not land that we're considering.
That's correct. It's not in the tender process at all.
Yeah, and it's not even adjacent.
It's not adjacent. It's in Liuzzi Street on what would be, I guess, the southwestern corner of the precinct, roughly.
I move that Councillor Lewis does not have either a real or perceived conflict of interest in the matter and is accordingly free to participate in the meeting while agenda item 16.2.1 is discussed, including by voting on the matter. Is there a seconder? Councillor Everard. I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously.
Mr Mayor,
Yeah,
I have
Councillor
another
Madden.
one.
Yep.
Okay. Mine is somewhat similar to Councillor Lewis's. It's in relation to item 16.2.2, the shortlisting of sites in Maryborough. My family trust owns a building in the CBD of Maryborough. This property is not subject to the call for tenders, but there may be a perception that this process will enhance values in the CBD, which may impact on the value of the family trust property. I don't believe that there's any, that family trust has any greater advantage than any other property within the CBD, and on that basis I propose remaining in the room subject to the will of the council.
Yep. I move that Councillor Mattern does not have either a real or perceived conflict of interest in the matter and is accordingly free to participate in the meeting whilst agenda item 16.2.2 is discussed, including by voting on the matter. Is there a seconder? Councillor Sanderson. Put the motion. All in favour? That's carried unanimously. Are there any further disclosures of interest? Councillor Taylor?
Yes, I've done the online form. It's relation to item 16.1.2. It relates to home-based business provisions, which is a motion put up by Councillor Madden. It specifically refers to regulated waste, which does not have any bearing on me, but my wife does own a home-based business, so there could be a perceived conflict. I don't think there is. So my intention was to inform the council that I have determined that I won't be raising it as perceived conflict, but giving the opportunity for any council believes that it is to raise it here. So while she does own a small business, it's a photography business, it doesn't deal with any noxious or hazardous materials, so there'll be no detriment. So I'm happy to be guided by the council, but it's my intention not to declare a perceived conflict or a conflict, but to inform the council of my relationship to my wife, who has a home-based business.
I move that Councillor Taylor does not have either a real or perceived conflict of interest in the matter and is accordingly free to participate in the meeting whilst agenda item 16.1.2 is discussed, including by voting on the matter. Is there a seconder? Councillor Light. I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? You can't vote. That's carried 10-0. Any further items?
You can't because you voted on the matter.
Oh, he can declare. That's just, if he's going to declare, he's going to declare.
Yeah, but we'll have to go back and
Yeah.
do the vote.
But that's better than him not declaring.
If he wishes to.
Yeah, Councillor Chapman? Yeah, think about it.
Mr Mayor, there was a item that was laid on the table at the last meeting, and dealing with a hospice in Harvey Bay. Now, if that actually comes up, I did put a form in last meeting, and I will be leaving the room as soon as that is
I think
mentioned.
your disclosure of interest carries over, or for certainty, well, if you'd leave the room anyway.
I will be leaving the room.
Okay, well, there's no motion then. Yeah, okay, yeah, so we minute
If
that.
that's
that-
if it does
if
come
it-
up.
Yeah, so we minute that in the event that it's taken off the table. Any further items? Councillor Sanderson?
I'll just, Mr Mayor, I'll echo similar to Councillor Tata's comments. I don't think it's a perceived or real. My wife works from home, but she also works on a laptop in many places across the region doing what she does, which she has her own business. So I'll declare that I don't think there's any conflict at all in relation to the item about waste and those things, but I'll, if council thinks so, I'd like to raise that now for transparency purposes.
We'll have to revote Stewart's then. I move. Yeah, okay, we'll just go back and do Councillor Taylor's one again. That Councillor Taylor does not have either a real or perceived conflict of interest in the matter and is accordingly free to participate in the matter, whilst agenda item 16.1.2 is discussed, including by voting on the matter. Who seconded that? Councillor Light, put the motion, all in favour. That's carried unanimously, 9-0. I move that Councillor Sanderson does not have either a real or perceived conflict of interest in the matter and is accordingly free to participate in the meeting, whilst agenda item 16.1.2 is discussed, including by voting on the matter. That's seconded by Councillor Truscott. I'll put the motion, all in favour. Any opposed? That's carried 9-0 again. Sorry?
He was scratching his nose, he wasn't.
Sorry, I was, do I have to state my wife's name and business, or it's on the form so it'll go through, but for the record, I think, am I required to state the
I don't
relationship?
think so. I mean, you've got,
The nature, it's on the form there, Mr Mayor. on the
This is the
front
name
page,
of the relationship.
Other side of this one.
Sorry.
So, councillors are required to state the nature of the interest and if they have the relationship, and how they tend to deal with it.
So did I address?
think
Yeah,
you
you
did,
did. You did
yeah.
mention that your
You
wife.
did, and the
yeah,
photography doesn't
yeah.
create noxious.
And so I think
waste.
for the purposes of the compliance with regulation, that satisfies.
Yep. Okay, are there any further disclosures of interest? If you think of one later, don't be shy. The next item is agenda item 4, mayoral minutes. There are no mayoral minutes. Agenda item 5.1 on pages 5 to 24 is the ordinary meeting, May's ordinary meeting. Councillor Edwards indicating he wishes to move that they be accepted. Councillor Madden seconding. I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Pages 25 to 53 is item 5.2, the special meeting, the budget adoption meeting. Is there a move that they be accepted? Councillor Truscott, seconded by Councillor Light. Councillor Lewis, do you have a question or
Yeah,
speaking?
well,
Yep.
just yes, I guess a question. I raised this in the briefing the other day, that the heading on those
Oh, yes.
pages was incorrect. I don't know whether we need to incorporate that in an amendment or not, but each of those, other than the first page, the subsequent pages are headed with a reference to the previous ordinary meeting rather than the special meeting.
So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. I don't believe that requires a resolution for an amendment. It's the minutes of the meeting in particular that's being resolved, but we'll make sure that that's corrected.
On the file, yeah.
Yep.
Yep. I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Item 6.1, a report on the public participation by the CEO.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. We only had one person who participated during public participation today. That was Mr Graham Wade. Mr Wade brought the council's attention to 5 items. The first item, he provided an update on flooding issues and disaster management. The second item he brought to council's attention was in relation to RV brochure distribution. The third item that he brought the council's attention to was the state of the entrance to Queen Street. The fourth item was his congratulations to the council for the work they did cleaning up the Sailing Club boat ramp area and the need for signage, and the fifth item related to street lighting in the Maryborough CBD.
So I need a motion that council note the verbal report provided by the CEO on the matter raised during public participation. That's moved Councillor Truscott, seconded Councillor Hanson. I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Is this where we're going to do deputations? Yep.
We can as well. We don't have.
Or we'd leave,
We didn't have a deputation.
oh, I thought, it's
We
not
just
the,
have an agenda item.
okay, we'll do it later, yep.
So-
Yep. Okay, the next item then is receipt of petitions. Are there any petitions to be tabled? No. Officers' report. Open resolution registers, page 54 to 89. I'm getting the parking one.
Yeah, so you can bring this one forward whenever you want.
Okay, yeah. I just wanted to mention one thing. I think this is in the open resolution. On pages, one of the open resolutions registered is either Councillor...
58.
Yeah, 58. The resolution about traffic options within the Maryborough CBD, Sanderson and Truscott. I wanted to, whatever motion we're going to move to accept this, I just want to move that also, that in addition to considering a permitted parking system in the CBD, the CEO be directed to consider the provision of free parking throughout the entire Maryborough CBD. As you probably are aware, okay, you say?
Mr Mayor,
Yeah,
conflict of interest
yeah,
on it.
okay. Yeah, okay. So as you're probably aware, there's only 2 paid parking areas left in Fraser Coast. One is the Harvey Bay Airport, which I think is appropriate. It goes some way towards funding by about $300,000 the significant costs of running a major airport. The only other paid parking on the Fraser Coast is here in Maryborough, which doesn't bring in a lot to the revenue, but I think it stands out as no longer the best practice, the best use. So I'll be moving that we take away the paid parking and just become regulated parking in that specific spot. So is that enough to add to that?
Yes.
Yeah. And
Yes,
so this,
yes, Mr Mayor, I believe you're moving a resolution, moving a motion that in addition to considering paid parking permitting system for parking in Maryborough CBD, you directed the CEO to consider and report on the provision of free parking within the entire Maryborough CBD.
and then that would come back in the report.
And that would come
Yeah.
back in the report. So, and it's been seconded, but I think Councillor Madden needs to move a conflict of interest
Yeah.
before there's any discussion on the matter or participation on the motion.
So, Mr Mayor, again, my family trust owns a property in Bazaar Street. This paid parking is in Bazaar Street. There could be a perception out there that it's advantageous to either ourselves or tenants in that property. I don't believe that is the case, as there is currently free parking opposite that building. However, in the interests of transparency, I propose declaring. I also propose staying in the room subject to the will of the council.
Thank you. I move that Councillor Mattern does not have either a real or perceived conflict of interest in the matter and is accordingly free to participate in the matter whilst agenda item 10.1.1 is discussed, including by voting on the matter. Is there a seconder? Councillor Truscott. Is anyone else going to declare an interest on this? No. I'll put the motion. All in favour? That's carried unanimously.
So you had a move, you had a second, and now the speakers.
Yeah, and I don't think that, I don't want to swamp the whole debate about the whole report, because this is just so any other discussion about the report, this is just an amendment I'm making that we adopt the report, be received and noted, but also that we add to the parking. So if there's any questions about other matters in the open resolution register.
You put that motion, it's been seconded, so it
That's
needs to
right.
go to vote on that motion.
Yeah.
And you need to come back to the open resolution motion.
I was moving it all at once.
Oh, okay.
Oh, we can do that. Actually, we'll do it separately. That makes sense. Okay, so we'll come back to the open resolution register in total, but this motion is just that in addition to considering a permitted parking system in the CBD, the CEO be directed to consider the provision of free parking throughout the entire Maryborough CBD. Are there any questions? Councillor Everard? Yeah. Any speakers?
When you just be specific about what free parking at the actual car park you're referring to?
Yeah.
But
That's what you're asking.
Yeah, I guess
it doesn't need to be specific to that particular car park. What would be looking...
Yeah.
Yeah, but the council may want to consider paid parking elsewhere. This actually
Well, no, I don't want to send us
Yeah.
in that direction.
So
I
this-
guess I'll reword it.
So I think the motion as it stands includes consideration of free parking in the entire Maryborough CBD, which negates the council from considering paid parking anywhere else apart from that location. I don't think you need to be specific. I don't think it adds value to the resolution.
It provides context. So what if I said that in addition to considering a permitting parking system in the CBD, the CEO would be directed to amend the conditions of the Bazaar Street parking lot with the effect of provision of free parking throughout the Maryborough CBD. Because, I mean, that's the effect of it, is that we're changing the rules at the Bazaar Street parking lot.
It's your motion, Mr Mayor. I don't think it adds or takes away from the original motion, but it's your prerogative.
Yeah, I think it should highlight exactly what we want to done. Yeah, so that in addition to considering a permanent parking system in the CBD, the CEO be directed to consider the amended provision, to consider the rules at the Bazaar Street parking lot with the effect of the provision of free parking throughout the entire Maryborough CBD. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's, just to I'm in support of that. I think that's a great initiative. But yeah, so I'm just wondering, because it's saying free parking throughout the whole CBD, but is it,
People still get fined.
but yeah, people
That's
still
going
get
to be the
fined.
confusion.
and
What's
the
going to
fact that-
happen is we're going to say that there's free parking throughout the Maryborough CBD. They're going to put it in the Chronicle. Somebody's going to park 6 hours in a 4-hour spot. They're going to
That's
get a
right.
fine, and they're
So
going to
it's
say,
still
we
gotta
said
be
it's free
So
parking.
it's still regulated
Yeah, there's still
parking,
regulated
but
parking.
no
But there's
paid
no
parking.
meters.
That's right.
Yeah,
yes.
so people can still be fined for speeding, for parking, for,
And because the idea of the original intent was to look at a parking permit, so obviously if that was to happen, that would be something that people pay for, but that's to avoid fines for parking too long in perhaps designated areas. I agree with this. I think what you've got is good, but yeah, so if we're specifying it that we're just removing paid parking from the Bazaar Street car park.
yeah.
Thank you. My understanding is that the Mayor's motion and the motion that's in the open resolutions register requires myself and my staff to provide a report back to council that considers the options of providing permit parking system and also considers the options of providing free parking, particularly with respect to the parking station that was identified. So it's simply a report for council then to consider whether they want to bring in a permit parking system or free parking or a combination of both. So there's no decisions being made today. It's just directing a report be
Yeah, and perhaps
obtained.
if there's a majority of people who think we
Yeah,
should have this permit system where people pay, then maybe we're not heading in the same direction
Well,
here.
that's why I'm just thinking the word free parking, because I think otherwise, like you said, that will get in the media and that's what people will go, oh, I'm going to park there all day. Whereas if it just specifically identifies the removal of the
meters.
need to pay for parking at the Bazaar Street car park and
Yeah.
not mentioning the rest of the
It's going
CBD
the
because
opposite
that's
way,
already
so
in
it's more
effect.
specific.
You don't
Okay.
have to pay for parking anywhere else.
Well, we've already got this motion, actually. I didn't think of it that way. Because, I mean, we've got this motion where we're heading towards another form of paid parking.
Well, it's an
Thanks to you
alternate
guys.
measure for business owners and employees so that they can stay in specific parking areas without getting fined should there be a
Yeah.
permit, if that were
I
to
think
be
the
the case.
point he's making is actually we need to go the whole other way to yours and actually go entirely specific about Bazaar Street.
I think it
because
needs to be very
because
specific.
If there's a motion on the books right now, which I wasn't fully across, I guess, that we do this other form of paid parking. Like, the two are actually not
I think it could still be
complementary.
part of the one report.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. We fully understand the intent and the desire of what the council's seeking in the report. This motion doesn't declare free parking. The council's made no decision with respect to free parking. It's made no decision with respect to paid permit parking. This council has simply asked me to provide a report. We understand what the council's intention is and it will be addressed as part of that report. I think squabbling over specifics on locations is
No,
If I
don't
can-
think
it's not
that.
squabbling
I
about
don't- well,
specific-
There's a real problem here.
It's just about
You
the
just
word
listen to him.
free parking.
We've got a motion up there where we're directing you to have more paid parking.
Well,
And now I'm amending it to say free parking throughout the entire CBD. They're totally contradictory.
Yeah.
So the motion, so my understanding of the the motion that was just moved and the previous motion is that we're going to come back with the report that addresses the concept of paid permit parking and also addresses the concept of providing free parking at that particular location. So the council then can make a determination whether it wants to have free parking and no paid permit parking, or free parking and paid permit parking, or or paid parking and permit parking, or any of those combinations. We understand what the intent is. There's no decision being made by council today to provide free parking or permit parking, simply to direct me to provide a comprehensive report, and we understand that and we can deliver on that.
I don't think anyone's suggesting we are making that decision today. It's more just the use of the wording of free parking, whereas it's just an addition of, for the report, that the report include the removal of paid parking at Bazaar Street car park.
And that will be considered in the report based
Well,
on
the
the
motion I've moved
recommendation.
is free parking throughout the entire Maryborough CBD. Which is inconsistent with,
Mr Mayor, and I totally agree with you and Councillor Truscott. That's what will be perceived in the community. They'll see 2, 4, 6, you know, those limits are not there as well. So I strongly encourage it. I understand what the CEO is saying as well. We just need to be careful how this is processed.
yeah, no, you're not listening.
I understand what
No,
you're saying,
you
so I
don't.
can produce the report.
Yeah, councillor Taylor?
So I'm not sure on the process. We have a resolution that was voted on. This should effectively be an additional motion brought by you, potentially either as a
Well,
mere
it is
amendment.
separate to, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so if we had that in isolation, effectively all you're asking for, and I can appreciate the council understands what your intention is, but does the community, by reading this motion, understand? And if we can't
No, that's
understand,
right,
I'm
yeah.
sure that the community is not going to be under. So my suggestion would be that you move this resolution to deal with the with the open resolutions register, and then you move a separate motion for the CEO. And if the CEO chooses to put those two together, then so be it. But all you're asking for is for a report to ask for paid parking to be removed from a specific location. And then you can bring that to because all we really want to know is what is the cost implication.
It's 17,000.
Yeah, so, but under our guidelines, we have to bring it, if it relates to finance, we have to bring it back as a report. So effectively you deal with one, and that would be the proper way. We don't want to get into a position where we start changing our open resolutions register by a motion on the day. It just seems a bit.
Okay, I'll ask the seconder if he's happy for my motion to be changed to that a report be brought back at the same time as the forthcoming report on parking in the Maryborough Central Business District Precinct to provide for free parking throughout the Maryborough CBD. So then at that point we can discuss whether we go to free parking throughout the CBD, or we keep the existing Bazaar one, or we bring in this new permit for workers. Yeah. So are you happy with that?
Yes, I think that covers it.
Does everyone understand that? So this is for a separate report to be brought back at the same time that considers free parking in Maryborough CBD. Yeah, free regulated, yeah.
Yeah, regulated is a good word to have in
Yeah.
there, because I think we'll
Yeah.
always continue to have regulated parking. So
Yes.
with respect, I'd suggest maybe you throw that in.
Yeah, free
But
regulated.
so just to be clear in my head now, we are not voting on the open resolutions register. We're voting on your motion, which is separate to the open resolutions register.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right, yeah. Okay, are there any speakers or questions? Okay, so hopefully this will could this come back to the next meeting, the August meeting?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so this would come back to the next August meeting, then we can consider the two reports at the same time and determine which way. I'll put the motion, all in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously, and we'll go back to the open resolutions register. Were there any questions on this? Councillor Chapman?
Mr Mayor, I'm just asking, on page 65, installation of lighting on Scarness Beach. What's the next step with that? We've had a report back from the community.
Yeah.
And was the committee informed about the hire, that they would be able to give the lights for hire?
Yep, thank you, Councillor Chapman, that's a good question. So, to answer your second question first, yes, the committee was made available of the offer by a local businessman to provide some lighting on Scarness Beach as a demonstration, but they didn't take that option up. So, where it stands at the moment, the installation of lighting on Scarness Beach has been deferred until such time as the council considers the community consultation. That matters on the table today, on the agenda today to consider. So after it's been considered by council, once that report's been considered by council, then it will be able to be and we'll be able to look at that request in the light of that outcome.
I just have a question on page 88, agenda item 11.1 of last meeting, where it was the glyphosate, where it was moved that the CEO provide a report on the use of glyphosate products used by the council and the risks associated with these products. It then says in the actions that we'll receive a report by December 2019. Can we not have it earlier than that?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. My expectation is that I can make a commitment that the report on the use of glyphosate products used by the council and the risk associated with these products and the mitigation measures will be on the agenda for the next council meeting. The trial, investigating trial alternative herbicide products that do not contain glyphosate will come back in December to allow a suitable trial period to understand the effectiveness of alternative products.
With it? Okay. Are there any further questions on the report? Not, is there a mover that the open resolutions register report be received and noted? Councillor O'Keefe, seconded by Councillor Chapman. I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? No, that's carried unanimously. Agenda item 10.2.1 on page 90 is the organisational performance report. Councillor Maddern.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, I'm happy to move that report be received. I did have some questions in the briefing. Those questions were answered satisfactorily, well, to my satisfaction, and I believe the advice was provided to all other councillors. So on that basis, I move that the report be received.
Is there a seconder? Councillor Everard. Any speakers or questions? I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? It's carried unanimously. The next item is item 10.2.2 at page 105. Councillor meter attendance for August 2019. Is there a mover for that recommendation? Yeah, question?
So thank you, Mr Mayor. Just a question to the relative directors. I filled out the online form the other day, but there was actually no feedback if that's been received or not. I think we're looking at that. Is that correct? And will we receive confirmation of submitting a form?
The form for?
Well,
for leave.
sorry, electronic form then.
For leave.
For,
okay.
Well, I've applied to be absent at one of those meetings. I did that as per the act and I've received nothing, so I don't know if it's gone through. Just a question if we're looking at confirmation.
I'll follow up that process through you, Mr Mayor, and ensure that we have an acknowledgement of receipt of those leave applications. Thank you.
Okay. So Councillor Maddern is moving this. Is there, or was this? Yeah, that's fine. Oh, sorry, yeah. Sorry. And seconded by Councillor Light. I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. The next item, page 108, quarterly progress report on the implementation of the corporate plan and operation plan, pages 108 to 127. Are there any questions on this? Okay, Councillor Everard is moving the council receive and note the quarterly progress report for the period April to June 2019, as per attachment 1. Is there a seconder? Councillor O'Keefe. I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. The next item is item 10.2.4, mobile customer service to remote communities, page 128 to 131.
Looks at me. Mr Mayor. I propose moving the officer's recommendation. I have got a little bit of a spiel I want to make, but do you want to get a seconder
Yeah,
first?
is there a seconder for this? Councillor Hanson? Yes.
So the original intent of the customer service van was to build some community engagement with those outer-lying communities, bring them back and make them try to get them to understand that they are part of the whole of the Fraser Coast and they're not just isolated. Obviously, in terms of financial situation and time and labour, it hasn't been all that successful in that financial assessment. I think as a community building exercise, though, it's been very effective, but I think the effectiveness is probably at its end. There are other mechanisms that we are currently using to meet up with our communities, and I guess one of them that's really, really clear is the governance workshops, where we've had large numbers of participants, in most cases over 100, and nearly all of the outer communities have been represented by a number of people. So those kinds of things, I think, now are the next stage to building that community connection between the outer-lying communities and the main urban areas, and in particular with council. I note in the report this suggestion that council officers attend annually a meeting of the community organisations. I think that's a great idea. I'd like to see it a bit more than once a year, though. I think at least twice a year would be good to keep that connectivity and to get, and to have, I guess, a face for people to talk to, because that's what they like. And in particular, some of our councillor officers have done a magnificent job over the last 2 years, and I would mention Melissa Dow and her team. Sadly, Melissa is leaving us, and that is a sadness that's been expressed by community members as well. But I think if we can continue to build, we don't need the customer service van anymore to achieve what was the original intent of the purpose of that customer service van. So I know there will be some people who will be sad that it's not there, but I think if we can put the options in place, particularly around the library, meeting with the individual groups, and some major events in those external areas, I think that would all be very helpful. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Are there any further speakers or questions? If not, I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Item 10.2.5, amended councillor discretionary funds policy, pages 132 to 142. Is there a mover for that recommendation? Yeah, councillor Everard, seconded councillor Lewis. Do you wish to speak to it? Perhaps you want to just quickly outline the changes?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So the policy was to just, the amendments are just to quickly clear up the policy by removing the specific mention of the amount, but referring to the grants, that the funding that's been provided in the budget. But importantly, the policy also now requires any discretionary funds that are used for events to comply with best practice in relation to disability and accessibility.
So that was moved, councillor Everard. Who's seconded? Seconded, councillor Lewis. I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. The next item is amended expenses reimbursement and provision of facilities for mayor and councillors policy, page 143 to 164. Is there a mover for that motion? Councillor Light, seconded by councillor Truscott. Are there any questions for speakers? I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Item 10.2.7, page 165, review of the competitive neutrality complaints policy. So the recommendation is on page 165 that we approve the reviewed policy as attached to the report. Is there a mover for this? Councillor Maddern, Second by councillor Everard. Are there any questions or speakers? I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Item 10.3.1 is on page 181 to page 184 of the approved inspection program, dog registration audit. Are you moving the resolution on page 181 to 182? Is there a seconder for that? Councillor Mattern, are there any questions or speakers? No. I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? No? Yeah, all in favour? Yeah, okay, that's carried unanimously. Item 10.3.2, the new Plumbing and Drainage Act of 2018 and Plumbing and Drainage Regulation of 2019, pages 185 to 191. And recommended, Councillor Chapman, do you have, you're moving that? The recommendation on page 186. Is there a seconder? Councillor O'Keefe, any questions or speakers? I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Item 10.3.3 on pages 192 to 201 is the adoption of the flood hazard mapping and minor amendment to a Fraser Coast planning scheme to update the flood hazard overlay maps, which is what you see on the table before you. On the table, to be tabled. So the recommendation is on page 193, and that must include tabling it, does it?
Yeah, it doesn't actually mention being tabled, but I think if we can note that the reports have been tabled.
So amend that.
Yeah.
Is that right, Jamie? So we should move an amendment to the recommendation. Do you have to explain why we're not moving the recommendation?
Yeah. So my understanding, Mr. Mayor, from the Executive Manager of Planning Development is that the reports have to be tabled. The resolution that's written in the report doesn't mention the tabling of the reports, so I'd probably suggest that a minor amendment, the first item should be that the council notes the tabling of the reports and then the rest of the recommendations as per the officer's recommendation. Would that satisfy the provisions of the Act? So, in that being the case, Mr. Mayor, recommendation 1, where it says, where it ends building regulation 2006, you could remove the full stop, put a comma and say as tabled.
As tabled. Yep.
The Mayor.
James, direct it through, you can direct them to me. I'll probably direct it back to Jamie or to Jared.
Okay, it might take me a little while to ask the actual question before so I just want to, it refers to, in relation, on page 196, in part 7 or paragraph 7, that the purpose of the Minister's guidelines and rules for making a planning change to reduce material risks of serious harm to persons or property on the premises from natural events or processes. Then it refers to in the report, and the purposes of it is to identify, in paragraph 2 on 192, to identify affected areas by flood hazards in the Fraser Coast Planning Scheme. And then in that same area it refers to defined flood levels. My question relates to the range of flood levels from lowest to highest. Can you firstly explain what is the lowest we have identified in the planning scheme that we believe meets the Minister's guidelines of affected areas, and what is the highest? I hope that question makes sense and I can explain my rationale or my thinking behind it if that needs be. So firstly, can you explain, for the purpose of the first question would be, what is the lowest range that we record as far as affected areas that are inundated by flooding?
Jamie can probably answer that.
Through the Chair, the mapping and what constitutes the hazard is defined as the 1 in 100 year flood event. Obviously, that would incorporate a range of height from 0 So it hasn't picked up anything from 0 to 150 in depth.
So if I could then ask that question then. So if we look at the figures on page 198, I don't know if you've got the same, let's just where it talks about the areas that have been added. Firstly, was the planning scheme, did it have the same range or the minimum start range of 150 mils previously, and this is just better recording, or have we reduced the range to receive where we've added, say, 7,498 into that
Thank you. Through the chair, the methodology has changed. The requirements for this particular flood model were set by the Flood Commission. Given that a lot of these particular studies that have been in place, Glenwood did not have a study, the Ely Creek and Tilton Creek were mid-2000 studies. We have
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
range of variables
Yeah.
going into determine, so they're sitting, they are
Yeah, that's something. Yeah.
We have different contour and LiDAR information. There is elements relating to the frequency of rainfall events, and accordingly we will have different mapping, and that's why it has changed, and so will the next one, both as the science, the modelling, and obviously any changes the Bureau brings in response to climatic changes that are occurring.
So on that note, does the Commissioner's or the Flood Commission's report and the Minister's guidelines from 2017 state that we are required to identify flood inundated areas as 150, like reduce it down to that level of 150 mils, effectively, what's that? About
6 inches.
15 centimetres, yeah, so it's, are we doing that based on the requirement by legislative requirements on, through, whether it be the Flood Commission report and the guidelines, do they specifically say it has to be as low as 150 mils?
Through the chair, my understanding is that the parameters that have gone into the model as recommended by the consultants who prepared it represents best practice and meet the requirements of the Flood Commission.
But I'm asking, does it exceed the requirements of the Flood Commission? Because there's a distinction between the two.
I'd have to take that as a question of notice, councillor. I believe that this is completed in accordance with the requirements of the Flood Commission. The Flood Commission's requirements are reflected through the state planning policy, and the state planning policy is the foundations for the Minister's rules. So when we prepare this, our brief is on the basis that we get a consultant to prepare a flood model that will ultimately meet the state planning policy provisions for appropriately reflecting a hazard within the planning scheme. So I could not confirm that we have either made this 150 mils as a conservative height or as whether it's diminished.
I guess my concern is that I can't object with the science and the contouring, modelling of this process, and I completely understand the processes. My only thing that I need to be certain of is that we are, and often there seems to be not only in this area but in other areas within local government in dealing with the Minister's office, we have legislative requirements and then we go for best practice, which effectively raises the bar higher, and that becomes the norm. I guess what I need to be satisfied with is that 150 mil best practice, or is for example, if the legislative requirements say that we're required to have it at 180 mil, should we not have it at that? So I guess that's one question I need to understand. And if there's a difference between the best practice that's been recommended by the consultant and the state legislation, I would like to know how many, what would be the changes to the numbers that have been added to this area. So I don't argue with the signs, I just want to make sure that figure, because you can appreciate people that have half a metre of 15 mils, of 150 mils in their backyard, receive a letter saying that their property is now affected by could be potentially affected. So I think it's fair that we ask that question.
So who do I ask that? Last
And I guess my other question would be, is it imperative that this matter be
No.
dealt with today?
No, Jamie can clear it up, but I don't think it is, and perhaps we should lay it on the table that's a valid question.
If I could, Mr Mayor, just the buffer that we've placed in it is based on risk. So we looked at a height of 150 millimetres. Given that the hazard overlay, the primary use of it is going to be for the purposes of determining building height, it's considered that 150 mils of water is enough that it could have an impact upon a building on a site when you're actually establishing a floor height. And accordingly, it provides that buffer. I cannot sit here and say that it's, the modelling as it's been completed is across that whole area of property with the data that's gone in is going to be exact down to the millimetre. What it does do though is it sets a starting point for actual investigation as part of each individual subsequent application of those, particularly, as I said, the building application. There will be an element of error that's come into this, that's added into the whole model, remembering that this is a computer model that just brings a whole suite of data together. But fundamentally, 150 mils is where you start to get into an area where you place a risk on inundation to any dwelling or building on the lot. Whilst it may only go into the corner of the block, in some other blocks it may exceed across the lot. But it might only be 150 mils. When someone builds a house there, they need to ensure that slab has that inundation. And today, with the number of houses you see that are built level, flat, or that close to what is the established ground level, that 150 mil is considered necessary.
Yeah.
to mitigate
Can I just ask, is there an imperative that we pass this today?
we have there's a process of my staff are waiting to be advised if it is or if it is not.
So that's
We
no.
have a suite of follow-up actions that we need to do, including GIS mapping, notification of ministers in Gazettal.
I think you're saying no?
It's council's discretion.
Yeah, okay. Well, no, I just really need to know, is there a legislative requirement? So if we lay it on the table, because I think there are other, Chet, you probably got questions?
Mr Mayor, I'd just like to point out my concerns with this whole system of flooding. When a general person in the public picks up a map like that and looks at... When the general person picks up a map and looks at the map, they don't know if they've got a metre of water that's going to flow through the house or 150 mils of that map. The LIDAR information I found out is virtually 3 years old. Things have actually changed within that 3 years with developments and everything like that. I would actually like to see different colours on that map, if it was ever possible that we can actually print a map in intervals so people could look at it to see. You could have 150 mils of flood water on your backwater on your property, which the water is not moving. Or you could be 150, you could have 150 mils beside a creek, which that water is at a high velocity. So we don't know where the dangerous water is, where the backwater is, or anything like that off those maps. And I know that the officers have done a lot of work in bringing all this information together, but to make it simplify so the public can actually understand and what is going on, and to say that this is a 1 in 100 and we haven't had a 1 in 100 yet, there is residents out there that are concerned when they look at this mapping, and I just think we need to refine that a bit better and find a better way of letting the public know what is really happening.
Yeah. Did you have a comment?
I was just going to ask, with your indulgence through you, Mr Mayor, if Jamie might be able to give us some details about, just in terms of the community concern, which is, is very real for some individual residents, but how many letters we sent out to people, how many responses we had, the range of responses that came back, but also the detail that Councillor Chapman's questioning. I understand a lot of that was in the letters, but...
So as part of this amendment process, process every property that was included in there, those that were removed, which wasn't a lot, all the new properties that were added into it, or all those that had a change, were given a formal notification of the proposed amendment. Now that notification included a whole package. The package incorporated general fact sheets about what the flood hazard mapping means, an actual individual flood report that you would, similar to you would get that anyone can come and actually acquire from council, given minimum and maximum heights of the land, given height of the flood on that land, so they could actually, each individual got a report that told them really everything they need to know about what the flooding characteristics were on their site, and that included the depth of the water. The flood hazard mapping, the council is absolutely correct. The flood hazard mapping is a crosshatch that goes across the whole Fraser Coast. These are 6 catchments that are covered by particular models. Maryborough is covered by the model. The rest of the Fraser Coast is covered by the Flood Commission model, which is very grainy and very rough. So we have this in existence now as a requirement. A conversion to an alternative, more descriptive
So that's a procedural motion.
mapping layer is proposed to be developed in the next 12 months. And council, when they adopted their budget, included a project which is to convert our flood hazard mapping into risk-based mapping. Very similar to what other council recent changes, which includes basically changing the mapping based on depth, velocity across, and that will, I believe, remove a lot of those properties that picked up under the periphery and the edges with the small backwater intrusions that we have under the current methodology. The bottom line is that we can change the variables, and as soon as we change the variables, we will change the line, but it will still pick up other properties that still have that same scenario if we were to change. So if we change 150 to 200, we're still going to have properties that are going to have 6 inches of backwater in the quarter of their property. So where do we start or move? The current issue we have is that we have a base computer model, we have a base process, we qualify it as much as we can, but it will pick up everything from inundation of 9 metres if you're situated in a merry, through to, in these particular instances, down to 6 inches of water in the quarter of their property.
Can I just go back to the timing? Is there anything catastrophic in us laying it on the table for the next meeting?
There's no catastrophic other than we have a series of provisions that are there, and we know what the modelling is. So we have properties out there that this has not been applied to, because it isn't part of the legislative requirement yet. So.
And what's the effect of that? Are people
The
going to be
effect
building
is
in the middle of a river?
There may be someone, no, in some of these areas there may be people carrying out development or certifies approving things on the old heights. We have the building resolution component that covers it off, flood hazard's the trigger.
Mr.
Yeah,
Mayor.
but you still haven't answered the question whether the heights of the commission and the minister is the same as the heights that we've adopted.
I would need to take that on notice. If that is the council's desire to have that question answered, we'd have to come.
I think it's a fair question. I'm not arguing with the science, I'm just arguing with
Yeah, it is
the
been
benchmark.
fundamental. Yeah, Councillor Adam?
Mr. Mayor, I had the privilege of being in Glenwood when the,
You're asking a question, right, or speaking for or against?
I'm speaking for, I
Nobody's
suppose,
moved it yet,
yeah, if you
anyway.
want to. But I don't think we have a mover, do we?
No.
Yeah, so you can only ask
So,
questions.
I'm
Yeah.
happy with, I'm happy to move it as it is,
Yeah.
put it that way. I'll speak.
Is there a seconder for it? Councillor O'Keefe? Yep.
Okay, in speaking toward this, I was privileged to be in Glenwood when our staff presented to Glenwood this flood hazard mapping. And clearly, there were a lot of clearly there were a lot of people down there that were impacted because there was never any flood study before, so there was the potential for it to be quite divisive.
Sorry, yeah.
All right, to keep going.
Yeah.
And one of the maps that was presented to the community set out the different levels, so, and it was coloured, so it was quite clear if you were on a fringe that you had 150 mils in the corner of your property and it wasn't really a worry. But you could dive down into a whole lot of it. All that consultation with that group at a group meeting, which potentially had the potential to be quite acrimonious, was gratefully received, and I did not hear one criticism. They were just very, very grateful for the flood study. Also understanding, or flood or inundation study, also understanding that this then became a tool in terms of emergency services at the point where we know that where the choke points were, where they had to get people out if there was a major event, and what the rainfall levels were that were going to cause those issues. So I was comfortable that the communication with the community was good, and I was comfortable that they understood what this was about, and they understood the benefits of it, knowing that some people were all of a sudden going to find out that they're in an area that may be impacted. But frankly, the reality is, whether you have this study or not, it's not going to make any difference to the event. It will happen.
So I've asked a question that has not been answered yet, and was still in the process of trying to understand whether or not there was a legislative impediment for a matter to be laid on the table.
That's right.
We now moved and seconded it.
Somebody has moved and second, which they could do at any stage. Yeah, I understand. I'm with you. There's still an outstanding question, which I would like to know.
And I mean, my desire was to have the matter lay on the table.
Yeah, you can move that right now. Yeah.
Well, as a procedural motion, I'm moving that this matter lay on the table until those questions can be answered.
Yeah. So we changed. So now we can speak for and against on the procedural motion. Didn't we change that?
No, we didn't move.
I thought we were going to. Okay. So I thought we did. We made
did.
some sort of change to the standing order. There was an issue at some point.
So through you, Mr.
So under the standing orders, 2.3.2, the chairperson, once a procedural motion has been put, the chairperson shall immediately put the question or to the motion or amendment to that motion under consideration. But the chairperson has a discretion as to whether to accept the motion to ensure that the matter has been reasonably debated. So if the chairperson accepts the motion, it goes straight to vote without discussion. But the chairperson could decide not to accept the motion to allow further debate and discussion.
Okay. I'll just say I won't accept it right now, because just so I can give you a few more minutes if you wish to take them, about why it should be laid on the table and why you don't have the information, rather than going straight to the vote. You don't have to do that. If you don't, I will accept it and put it to. Well, that's the point. We don't have it. Yeah. So I haven't accepted the procedural motion yet. Councillor Lewis has got a question.
Yes, it was just a question as to whether that particular provision, unfortunately I left in a rush this morning to dodge the smoke, and I left my standing orders at home. I thought that provision related to a procedural motion, that the motion be put. I didn't think it related to other procedural motions, such as that the matter lay on the table.
The standing orders don't define a difference, but doesn't specify that it's under the procedural motions section. It doesn't relate to any specific procedural motion.
Councillor Everard.
In the interest of time and sanity, is it possible for the CEO to direct an officer to make that phone call and find out what the information is, and then we can come back to this matter in this meeting?
So, Mr Mayor, if the matter...
That would require it being laid on the table anyway.
Exactly.
But it would also require some sort of initiative to be taken in the next hour to find the information.
Jamie, will that be done? Yeah, we'll do it. Thank you, Mr Mayor. I think if it was laid on the table, that would give our officers time to be able to make contact with the relevant state government departments and be able to provide a full and comprehensive response to Councillor Taylor's questions.
Okay, I accept Councillor Taylor's procedural motion that the matter lay on the table. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. And I might just quickly move around to item 16.1.3, which is in the supplementary pack. the Harvey Bay Esplanade Community Engagement Project Panel Report, because we have a couple of members from the panel here, Tina Greenhall and Paul McKenzie. 16.1.3, which will be in one of the supplementary. Yeah. Yeah. And so Terence wasn't able to make it, was he, Paul? No, okay. So did we want them to perhaps present it, or?
We're happy to maybe formally hand it
Yeah.
over to the CEO, but
Okay, yeah, we'll do that.
I don't know if they want to actually say.
Yeah. Tina and Paul, do you want to come up here? Okay. Would you? Yeah, we just want to thank you for all the, I know it was 5 or 6 weekends, it was a lot of work, a lot of thought and consideration went into this report. It's a new level of community engagement. We've never done this type of deliberative democracy over weeks and weeks and with this amount of information, this amount of engagement. So, we know we put you through a lot of, thought and a lot of, mental stimulation to think it through and come up with these recommendations, and we're very grateful for your contribution. I think it's the type of community engagement that we want to continue in the future, where we're getting a really good representation of the community to think through an important issue and present their reports, which we're receiving today.
It's a privilege.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, I think the best thing that came out of it was seeing how many people from different divisions would get together
Mhm.
and actually work through things that they did agree with or didn't agree with.
Mhm.
It was actually awesome to turn around and have that experience.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah.
The facilitators did a wonderful job and running the show, and it was really an eye-opening experience.
Yeah.
And it gave every division
Mhm.
an opportunity to speak. I think that in this day and age of changes and amalgamation
Yeah.
was seriously needed.
Mhm.
Preparation for the future.
Yeah.
For Fraser Presidency.
Yeah.
And Fraser Presidency.
Yeah, no, thank you both so much. Yeah, we really appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, so item 16.1.3 is the stapled one. Page 772. So the recommendation is there at the bottom of page 7.2. We'll receive it and delegate to the CEO to prepare a response, with the response to be tabled at council meeting, next council meeting, 28th of August. Is there a mover for that, Councillor Lewis? Are you amending
Yes,
that?
Mr Mayor, I was proposing to move a slightly
Yep.
varied one, if I may.
Yep, yeah, read it out, yeah.
I have circulated, but for the benefit of the people in the audience, the first recommendation is unchanged. And the second one is that delegate to the Chief Executive Officer to prepare a draft response to the community panel's report for consideration of council and subsequent presentation to a later ordinary meeting of council.
Yeah, I understand, yeah. So basically, the intent, including the word draft.
Yes,
Yeah.
it includes the word drafted, and it doesn't lock us into the August one. Perhaps after there's a seconder, I'll explain my
Okay, yeah.
intentions.
Councillor Everard, you're seconding it, yeah? Do you wish to speak to it?
Yes, thanks, Mr Mayor. And can I join with you, Mr Mayor, and the CEO in my thanks and compliments to the panel. It's a terrific amount of effort they put into it. The reason for my change is that I felt when I read that recommendation that it sounded a little bit like the response would be prepared and then we would simply accept it at the next meeting. For one reason or another, at this stage, Council hasn't had an opportunity to consider the report in detail, except so far as people may have done it individually. I had some correspondence with the CEO about this report after it was circulated and posted on the council's website, and the CEO indicated that the next step would be a report which would analyse the various recommendations and provide a response to them, and that report would then be discussed by council. So that hasn't happened yet. The purpose of my slightly amended resolution is really to enable councillors to workshop that draft report, and then to the extent that there may be any variations to the draft report, they can be incorporated in the report which comes back to council at the earliest convenient meeting.
Yep. Did you wish to speak to it? Are there any further speakers or questions? If not, I'll move the motion with the amendment from the recommendation. All in favour? Any opposed? It's carried unanimously. So we'll go back to the order. Sorry, yeah. Item 10.3.4, microbats, page 202 to 208. Thanks, Paul. See you too. Okay, is there a mover for that recommendation? Councillor Everard, seconded by Councillor Chapman. Did you wish to speak to it? No? Any questions, speakers? No? I'll put the motion. Councillor Truscott.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Just one question. I noticed in the conclusion on page 203, it talks about putting any artificial nest into the boxes resulting wouldn't really have the likelihood of a significant boost to microbat numbers is low. But then in the report on page 207, it talks about, therefore, any initiative to increase microbat diversity and microbat numbers is worthwhile. So it talks about it being worthwhile, but sort of not really worth doing. So I just wondered if there was any sort of clarification on that.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor. So I understand how they can seem contradictory, but they're both correct in the sense of that the hit rate of actually installing them in Aldershot, my team advised following speaking to the bat groups and others, would be quite low, and their effect on focusing on mosquitoes would be quite low. That said, they do provide an important range of other, I suppose, positives to our biodiversity and our local environment. So essentially what the team are saying is more bats and more microbats is a good thing, but putting those microbat boxes in of itself is not going to move the needle significantly.
I'll put the motion, moved by Councillor Everard, seconded by Councillor Chapman. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Item 10.3.5 on page 209 is the Development Service Charter. And that's been distributed to. Is there a mover for that recommendation on page 209? Councillor Chapman, seconded Councillor O'Keefe. Are there any speakers or questions? I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Item 10.3.6, Discover Fraser Coast Regional Wayfinding and Content Management Strategy, pages 221 to 279. The recommendations on page 222. Is there a mover for that? Councillor O'Keefe. Is there a seconder? Councillor Everard. Are there any speakers or questions? No. I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Item 10.4.1 at page 280 to 291 is the vehicle crossover driveway policy. Yeah, Councillor Everard, seconded Councillor Chapman. Are there any speakers or questions? I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Item 10.4.2, Local Disaster Coordination Centre Feasibility Initial Report, pages 292 to 326. Yeah, Councillor Light's moving the recommendation at the bottom of page 292. Is there a seconder? Councillor O'Keefe. And do you wish to speak to it?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just very briefly, it's been discussed before the need of a dedicated local disaster coordination centre. We've seen the evidence of the tangible benefits of it recently in Townsville. I believe it just opened a few weeks before they had the major incident up there. We've also had the privilege to go to Yeppoon and look at their facility up there and how it also has multi-uses, particularly in education, and for other different community-based services. It's actually quite exciting. So hopefully when we look at the new CBD and new administration centre, this will be a key part of it. This is not a waste of money. This is needed to have those facilities. That can be used for other purposes when I say that the LDMG doesn't go to war. But if we need to do that, we need those facilities because it's a core part of our business's disaster response. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Yep. Any further speakers? I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Item 10.4.3 on pages 327 to 333, motions to the LGAQ 2019 annual conference.
Mr Mayor?
Yep.
I propose moving the amended officer's recommendation, which was circulated, has a third motion in relation to drought. Do we need to read that out?
Yeah, you can.
Sorry, I'm not prepared. Has Chloe got a copy of it? Sorry. Thank you. Thanks very much. So the amended motion is the same as in our hard copies, with the third motion that LGAQ work with the federal and state governments to update the arrangements to classify drought as an eligible disaster under DRFA that will allow council to assist and support the community during this time.
Yep. Is there a seconder? Councillor Everard? Any questions or speakers?
Can I just speak briefly to that third
Yep.
motion? This was actually raised with me through the water section of the LGAQ, but in listening to the radio, you'll understand that in southern Queensland there are some drought councils that are terribly drought affected, and their capacity to deliver water to their residents is becoming very marginal. The same it's in New South Wales, where they haven't in the past been prepared for drought. So the idea of this is that councils can, a drought is slow moving, but it is just as impactful on the community and on council's infrastructure as a flood or a cyclone. So the idea is that as a result of these terrible droughts, and when they finally break, we have some knowledge and understanding of drought preparedness for councils and what's required for their water infrastructure, and gives those councils an opportunity to tap into a source of funding. I note that the federal government has now implemented a drought fund, and that drought fund may be the fund that councils may be able to tap into, as well as the NDRAA, the regular NDRAA funding. So this is really about our fellow councils who are suffering badly in this drought and their ability to provide water to their residents.
Yep. So you're moving that and the initial two as well?
Yes,
Yep.
yes,
So,
in combination,
yeah.
so.
Yep, the three, yep. So we have a seconder, yeah, Councillor Everard. I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Item 10.5.1, waste strategy for 2019 to 2029, pages 334 to 518. Yes?
I'll move that, but there's an amendment on one of the pages,
Yep.
a change in the wording, and I can't remember which point, and I had the page folded out, now I can't
It's
find
only
it.
somewhere between 334 and 518.
So it's, yeah, that's probably it. Actually, it's on page 367, 5.3, under the heading Improved Recycling Service. Instead of the word introduce, we changed that to the word investigate recycling service for residents and commercial businesses that enable recyclables and organics to be stored and or processed at council waste transfer facilities. So
This is for Fraser Island.
this is, well, it's part of the strategy.
Yeah.
So it's to adopt the strategy with that amendment
Yeah,
on
so-
that one page.
Yeah. Can I ask Director Banner his view on that?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. That that shouldn't be a problem. The second action within that section actually refers to that investigation, I think. And
Yeah,
so,
that's what I was going to say, it's more a typo.
it is, that's
Yeah.
right. And so an investigation will be the first step in that process.
Yep. Is there a seconder for that, for the motion? Seconded by Councillor Everard. Did you wish to speak to the report as a whole?
No, I think it's been self-explanatory. There's been a lot of consultation around it. I commend the officers for the consultation and the process, and I think we just need to get on with it now.
Yep. Can I put a question to the director? In terms of on Fraser Island Gari, the waste transport, sort of the transfer facilities at Orchid Beach and Eurong, does this report, this talks about us improving, I think, the Eurong one first, and then using that as a test for Happy Valley? And is the intention that we move to a hard surface or keep it a sand surface? Because there's stuff's breaking down and ending up in the sand.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for the question. So certainly throughout the development of the process or the development of the strategy, we engage specifically with regards to waste management on Gari. The intention is certainly to harden the sites, and harden the sites could mean having a concrete slab, or it could mean other ways that we can actually better manage the service on the island. And so at the moment there's waste stockpiles on those transfer stations that are just on sand, and so the intention will be to design a solution that is more commensurate to the environment that the Gari is. And so at the moment I think the strategy actually reflected the staged rollout of those processes, with the design and construction I think at Eurong first. We may review that depending on the condition of those sites, and so I think there is an operational preference to potentially look at Happy Valley first, but either way it'll be a staged process. But the strategy currently identifies Eurong as the first one off the rank.
Okay, yeah. All right, any further questions or speakers? I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously with Councillor Truscott out of the room. Yep. Okay. Item 10.5.2, Waste Management Fee Concession Policy, pages 519 to 533.
Mr. Mayor, do we have to note that there's two conflicts or three conflicts?
Well,
or four
Stuart's
conflicts?
leaving. We're at agenda item 10.5.2. Yeah. That's gonna be. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. The recommendation is on page 519 that council adopt the waste management fee concession policy. Is there a mover for that? Yeah. Councillor Light, second by Councillor Lewis. Are there any speakers or questions? I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. CEO will find Councillor Taylor. Yeah. Just waiting for Stuart. Okay, so we'll go to your item now, Anne. I think it's your item. Okay, so the next one on my agenda, one of the late items, 16.1.1 on page 770 of the supplementary pack, assistance from Fraser Coast Regional Council to prospective buyers and sellers of property. Yep.
Mr. Mayor,
Councillor Madden, do you wish?
I
You're moving
wish
this?
to move that motion.
Is there a seconder? Councillor Chapman, you wish to speak to it, Councillor Madden?
Yeah, just briefly, Mr. Mayor, this is one of these ones that have just popped out at us in that the sense that there are now appear to be issues developing in the real estate industry around a requirement for final certificates on houses that have been constructed significant number of years ago. This may be a spot fire, but it also may be the beginning of a wildfire. I believe some of it may well be generating out of the fact that there have been a couple multi-storey buildings in Sydney and Melbourne that showing major cracking and obviously some issues around that. My experience in the real estate valuation industry is that with insurance the way it is, It can just take some executive somewhere in the USA or in England to say, we don't like that, we're going to throw a clause in. We have some issues within our council area in terms of amalgamation, in terms of documentation, which we are somewhat problematic. This is calling for a report so that the community and councillors can understand what the issues are around our documentation and what we can do to ameliorate that and to support the real estate industry, not particularly real estate agents and valuers, but the purchasers and the sellers. It's a huge part of our economy and we need to keep it moving. We don't need roadblocks, and if we can do whatever we can to prevent those roadblocks within the bounds of the law, obviously. So again, it's a process to have the information available so the community understands what the issues are and what they may or may not need to do to help themselves, and we will help them as much as we can.
Councillor Chapman, as seconder, do you wish to speak?
Yes, Mr Mayor, I agree with what Councillor Madden's just said here. It's all about helping the residents out there that aren't quite sure of what's going on. And I think this report that will come back will show that the council, well, hopefully will show the council want to support and keep the industry going.
Yep.
Thank you.
Councillor Lewis.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. This is partly a question, but just a comment. Some years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, I needed to, for a building that my wife owned, needed to obtain details of a planning approval. And it took a lot of work, and all I was able to obtain, this is an approval given under the Hervey Bay City Council back in the 1980s. At the end of the day, the only document we were able to obtain was a copy of the minutes of the Planning Committee, which had approved it, not a copy of the ultimate ordinary meeting, which had confirmed that. And there seemed to be a problem with the documentation available, at least from that era, from the Hervey Bay City Council. Recently, that building sold, and one of the standard provisions of a commercial land and buildings contract is that at settlement, the seller should provide a copy of the certificate of classification, unless it's a dwelling. The buyer's solicitor asked me to provide that. My inquiries with the council indicated that might take 10 days or whatever, 10 working days to produce. Fortunately, the buyer decided that he wouldn't delay settlement, he'd settle without it, but there is a risk if those documents aren't readily available, and frankly, I don't know whether the document would have come to light, given that that document would have dated back to 1985 as well, or 86. So I suppose my question is really, can this report, I don't want to worry about amending the motion, but can this report also look at that issue as well, to see whether there are gaps in the documentation that's readily available? I anticipate that it will, given the discussions we've had, but I just wanted to make sure that it will.
Jared.
Yeah, through you, Mr Mayor and Councillor Lewis, definitely we'll look to cover those issues. I've already got, had some preliminary reports run this week, and on the stuff that's actually coming through the system, there is a high level of intact documentation. These issues, and we've had a couple of them in the sort of 8 months that I've been here, but it has been a couple. So I don't believe it's widespread, but we will cover all of those issues. I'm also planning to cover, and I think it's important for the community to understand that there are some records which councils were never required to keep. That the obligation is actually on the owner of the properties to keep them, because there's been lots of different legislative change in both building and planning acts over time, and at certain intervals there were provisions for council to hold records for 10 years, and then they didn't have to be kept beyond that for certain types of documentation and the like. So I really think the motion is going to allow us to clarify all of those issues about the different types of legislation that existed at different times, what council had to require. Are there any gaps that we're aware of? And then what can the community do, or what can we do to help the community if they find themselves in the middle of one of those challenging circumstances?
Councillor Maddern? Yeah.
Just to say thank you to the staff for having done a lot of work behind the scenes. I know this motion sits here, but I know there's a lot of work that's happened in the last couple of weeks, and in particular in one case, and just to say thank you to the staff for that work.
Thank you. Okay, I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Oh, yeah. Item 16.1.2, home-based business provisions, on page 771 of that same pack. This
Mr.
is
Mayor,
Councillor Maddern moving again.
Yes, I will move this
Is there a
again.
seconder? Councillor Light, do you wish to speak to it?
Yes, I do. And this has come about as an instance where when you live in a residential area, you expect a certain amenity in that area, and what has come about is an indication that our town plan may not actually provide that amenity in residential or in rural residential area. It's about a truck with sewage septic pump out in, like within 20 metres of someone else's backyard. As I understand it, and I've amended it, in the first instance I thought it was regulated waste. I found out now that it's not, but it's still noxious and hazardous. It does damage the amenity of the next door neighbours. It probably also has an impact on their values, and I'm very cautious about saying that, having been a property valuer for a long time. So what I'm asking for is if we can have a look at our town plan and see whether there are instances where a home-based business, even though it may lawfully fit under the current town plan, is having an impact which is undesirable on the neighbours, and to see whether there may be amendments that council would like to take forward in the future. Town plans don't catch all, and I think this is one where it's come out of the woodwork that we don't catch it properly. And I mean, I'm not opposed to home-based businesses. I have one operating next door to me. Does not impact on my amenity in a residential area at all, and I'm sure there are many, many others in the same. But when you start talking about noxious and hazardous materials, I think it's something that we need to review and have a look at.
Thanks. Councillor Light, a seconder. Do you wish to speak? Any questions or speakers? I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. The next item is item 16.1.4, amended acceptable request guidelines, on page 1400 of today's agenda, which is supplementary 3. Yeah, which is this one. So there's a recommendation there that council approve the draft acceptable request guidelines for councillors and employees, access to information and confidentiality for councillors policy as per attachment 1. Is there a mover for that? Councillor Everard, second by Councillor Keith. Are there any questions for speakers? The principal change is simplifying it, so it's about levels, and CEO might be able to explain it better, the levels of management rather than specific positions, because that can always change, and council's access to the documents management system, which will be restored.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I don't think I need to provide any further clarification. I think you summed it up brilliantly.
Okay. Okay.
So the change is, in fact, the elected position is that we didn't have access to the electronic document management system, and now we do with provisions.
Yeah, well, we always had access to the document management system, but there was a category that we were in, which is elected members, which now we're going to be in the category all staff, which is a much broader one rather than just agendas, but a lot more documentation. it's sort of a technical IT question, but it is about councillors having ready access to more information and more documents. Now, it's something I think is important.
And Mr Mayor, if I can just add, and the other issue of concern was that the council's access wasn't provided under acceptable request guidelines previously, and that's the appropriate head of power for council's right and access to information.
Is there a mover for this? Councillor Everard, second by Councillor Light. Any further speakers or questions? I put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Item 16.1.5 on page 1429 of the agenda. This is leave of absence for Councillor Hanson which will cover the ordinary meeting of next August, as well as councillor briefings. Is there a mover for this? Councillor Madden, seconded by Councillor Truscott. Put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Do we say 10-0, or does James vote on this?
I did.
Yeah, you can. It doesn't matter. Yeah, okay, yeah, unanimously 11. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. Going to general business. Is there any general business? Not. I think that's the last of the open before we go into confidential. Is that correct? Yep. Jamie, do we have an answer back yet?
Through there, spoken to the relevant officers in infrastructure services to ascertain, and the answer is a lot more complex than a simple, it's a depth. They've also identified that when we've identified or they've modelled hazard, they've also considered the characteristics of the flow. So the duration, how long the area is inundated for, at a depth, the flow velocities that go into it. So it is a complex model that has set a series of parameters that have resulted in the establishment of the hazard. To get further detailed advice, we would need to go back and get the advice of the consultants.
So could I ask a question then that might help me understand? In the planning scheme, what is the level that you have to build up above the defined flood level? So the defined flood level for us is obviously 150 mil. So if that we've set. For example, another council to our west has a defined flood level of 250 mil rather than 150 mil, and then they have a do not build. You have to build 300 mil above that. So effectively, if you were to measure that from our point of view, it would be their building level would be 450 mil above.
So, Councillor, for the purposes of the building resolution, it'd be 300 above.
So when you were talking about before, there's a responsibility. We can't have buildings built at 100. That they need to be built. With that. Obviously, if there's 150 mil of water, you don't want them at zero depth. The fact is, the planning scheme already makes it a requirement that whatever level we set, it has to be 300 mils above that. So effectively 30 centimetres above that planning scheme. So
yes, correct.
So effectively, if let's say putting it down to 150 mil, you're actually increasing that by another, rather than 300 mil, you're effectively making it 400 mil.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Absolutely correct. Currently, the defined flood height. So if anyone was building on a block, they did a flood search, we'd actually be able to, for the purposes of the location of where they're going to stick the dwelling, identify what height is the flood height. The finished floor for habitable rooms would have to be 300 above that.
So just so I can understand from from a layman's, not from a scientific point of view, there is a layer that is for building above the flood inundation or the flood level.
Yep.
Yep. In other areas, council has set that the what we call the defined flood level to be 250 mil. We have set it at 150 mil, and we have a buffer of 300 mil, and they also have a buffer of 300 mil, roughly. So either they are not meeting the legislative guidelines, or we are exceeding them.
So these men.
Okay, hang on, Jamie, Jared's got something.
I'll let you elaborate further, Joey, but the part where I can be specific, because I have read the state planning policy this morning and the guidelines on preparing flood studies, council does clearly have the ability, the state says, to go beyond their minimum levels. So the 300 is state mandated, and they do say that, you know, that part in terms of the free board, councils could adopt 500 if we, you know, if you determine that you thought climate change was a bigger issue, or climate variability, or things like that. So you do have that ability.
But we're not changing that, are we?
No, we're not changing that. That's the state mandated free board. Part of the challenge, though, from reading it this morning in terms of answering the specific question, is essentially, as my understanding of it is, you can adopt the state mapping, which has no granularity about it. It doesn't give you depths or velocities or stuff like that. It's just you flood or you don't flood, or you can do your own detailed studies and then use those, and that's what the process we're going through. But
And that's my other areas that have been impacted by the Flood Commission report, have done their own studies and set at 250 mil. My question relates to, because when we talk about flow, if you look at the Eli Creek catchment or the Tuan Creek catchments, they're not river. The most of that is rain catchment, isn't it? So most of it will be water that's sitting. So I guess my question is what is the difference between a 250 mil benchmark with a 300 mil requirement to build up to? So what is the difference on how many would be added? Because effectively, if you look at 3,334, we've identified as people that are affected by a natural disaster or a natural. If I'm able to vote on this, and I've seen examples of areas that actually have significant flood impact from high velocity rivers compared to these rivers, I need to understand why we set it at a 150 as opposed to a 250. And secondly, I would like to know how many would be removed. If it's a case that none would be removed, then that would help make my decision. But if it's more than half.
Yeah.
We were debating and discussing this, but we actually haven't taken this off the table.
No, we haven't, no.
So I'm still asking.
Yeah, so we're in general business, and he's just asking a question, yeah. So I don't know if it has been answered, and I don't know if I'm comfortable with being taken off the table, and. Yeah, well, you don't need to move it, yeah. Jamie,
If I may, Mr. Mayor, the 150 mil has been applied for purposes of trying to get some reasonableness around the hazard layer. When we run the model for the purposes of determining the floor height, we will give them the Q100 height. No matter what that actually says, if the property is included or not, it will still be included, and the properties will still be subject to flooding in a Q100 event. It is a hazard layer which is a trigger for further assessment, which will then have the details dealt with by the certifier or by actual survey. So we can change this to 250 and we can change the hazard level, but it doesn't change what is the mathematical Q100 height that we should be applying to that property.
So my question is then why? Why would we keep it at 150 mil? If the only difference is that someone gets a letter saying that their property is impacted.
Further to that, Mr. Mayor, it's, for example, with the modelling, we've taken out the 50 mil rain grid. So during a Q100 event, there'll be 50 mils of water across every block of land on average, because of the amount of flow. In a Q100 event, we've got a significant rain event that's occurring. It's bucketing down. You will have approximately 50 mils, the model established across most blocks during that event. That's been removed out of about establishing what is a reasonable appointment for the purposes of bringing in the hazard mapping, which again is just a trigger for detailed assessment, and that represents what is the recommendation of the consultants we've hired as the best practice for qualifying. But as I pointed out before, there are a lot of others. If we wish to change to 250, we'll go back and rerun all the models again.
Okay.
It's not a matter of just changing, we've actually got to rerun that as a component of the model.
Okay, well, if we're going to consider it, somebody will need to move comes off the table. Yeah, Devendra, you got a comment?
Through the chair, Jamie has covered some of the bits that I wanted to talk about. The only bit I want to add is that we issued letters to more than 12,000 properties, and the concerns they were raised were by less than 100. So we've dealt with all of them. So that's less than 1% of the residents that has raised some concerns. So we worked through them and explained some of the confusion they had in terms of the plan. So just wanted to put something in perspective in terms of, you know, if there is a large number, if there is a view that there is a large number of complaints and concerns, it's not the case that we are, you know, the concerns that has been raised with us directly. Thanks.
So can I ask clarity? You're saying that people received notifications that they were impacted by this change that had less than 100 mil?
No, I'm saying that more than 12,000 letters were sent to the property owners. We only received less than 100 responses concerned about the information that went out, and we worked through each one of them.
Did you refer to 100 mils there or not?
No, I didn't say
100
that.
letters.
I said 100 people,
responses.
100 responses back. Thanks, Mr.
So, but 7,000 were added, not 12,000. You're not going to get out of the 3,160. You're not going to get complaints from people asking for you to put them back into the flood mapping. So that's you were sent letters out to people who are added, here people who are removed, and people who are retained. Sorry, so the retention ones you're probably not going to get.
I'm comparing with the total number of letters that were sent out to the affected property owners.
So presumably the 100 that came back were people who were added,
Yeah.
Yeah.
which is a smaller pool, which is from a smaller pool than 12,000. Okay, we'll proceed. If somebody wants to deal with the matter today, they need to move that it be taken from the table. Okay, I'll put that in motion. All in favour? So which way are you voting, Daniel? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. All against? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's lost. Okay, so we got that's. Is there any further general business? All right, before we go into confidential, I need to move a procedural motion, which Councillor Chapman will need to leave the room for, that the matter request for funding Fraser Coast Hospice be taken from the table. I put that, I'll wait till Dennis leaves. No, it's a procedural motion, right? Yeah.
We need to vote.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for Dennis to leave. I'll put the motion. All in favour? That's carried unanimously. Do you want to get back in? Dennis?
Hey, Dennis.
Okay, that's right. We're just going into confidential now. Okay, so there's no further general business? If not, I move that council resolves that under the Local Government Regulation 2012, the meeting be closed to the public for the purpose of considering 15.1 Local Government Infrastructure Plan under Section 2751G of the Act, 15.2 Draft Urangan South Plan Report under Section 2751H of the Act, 15.3 Enterprise Management System Procurement under Section 2751E of the Act. Item 15.4 Contract Award under Section 2751E. Item 16.2.1 Tenders Received New Fraser Coast Administration Centre under Sections 2751E and H of the Act. Item 16.2.2 Shortlisting Expressions of Interest Fraser Coast Admin Centre and Maryborough CBD under sections 2751E and H of the Act, and the one we've just taken from the table, request for funding Fraser Coast Hospice under sections 275H of the Act. That's a procedural motion, isn't it? So no seconder. I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Yep. Yeah, we're in confidential, so we'll wait till the door is closed and then,
Sorry?
yeah.
Master?
This will take, I think we'll be discussing a few things a while. Yeah, what we'll do is we'll go into confidential, we'll take the lunch break then. I don't think we need to,
Well, you're still in the meeting.
Yeah.
So if you're in confidential, you're still technically in a meeting, so you cannot have, so if you go and have lunch, you cannot have conversations or discuss any matters that
Yeah.
aren't on the
Yeah,
agenda.
we will.
So can I move the procedural motion that we adjourn to
So you need a quorum in your room to keep the matter confidential. If everyone leaves, the matter's very adjourned.
So if you're going to adjourn, we should come out of confidential,
Yeah, okay.
adjourn, and then go
Okay,
back into confidential.
I move that we come out of confidential. All in favour? That's carried unanimously. I take the motion that we adjourn for a period of how long? 20 minutes? 20 minutes? Put the motion. All in favour? That's carried unanimously. Okay.
I'm just looking, George, when you said confidential, you don't need, I don't know if confidential is it's not a procedure.
Okay, when we go back in, I'll get a seconder.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's National Office Works or something like that.
Yeah, they're comfortable.
Oh, yeah, I can see that at all. Wow. These are real firm. I'm gonna buy one myself. They're nice. Oh, well, they're low, huh? Yeah, they're low. Yeah. The other thing is, it's an actual book. It's like a vinyl label. It's the camels that come second to the races last year. I'll find out exactly what they are. And the other thing was I had a whole one of these speakers. When you sit there, when you sit here, there's no leg room. Oh, really?
Your legs, you try to put them here, and I see Rob, he's doing the same. Hey, did you see that email?
Which one?
I sent you an email with that. Can you let someone have a look at that?
Okay, yeah, all right. Holly is away today, I should be back tomorrow. I'll get her to look at that. Yeah, look, I mean, it's, you know, it's, I don't know where exactly he is in the catchment, whether it's actually the runoff, whether it's the runoff or whether it's the bathtub effect, so. It sounds like it could be a runoff issue. Impact by the runoff.
the meeting be reconvened. Councillor O'Keefe, all in favour? That's unanimously carried. So I'll move that we go into confidentials for items 15.1 to items 15.1, point 2, point 3, point 4, and items 16.2.1 and 16.2.2, and item 15.3 from the last council meeting, the hospice, under sections 2751 G, H, and E of the Act. Is there a seconder for that? Councillor Mattern, I'll put the motion. All in favour? That's carried unanimously. So we're now in confidential. Fraser Coast Hospice Association report from the June meeting. I will move to item 15.1 on pages 535 to 595. Councillor O'Keefe is moving this motion and Councillor Everard is seconding. Are there any speakers or questions? I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Item 15.2, this is moved on pages 596 to 700. This is moved by Councillor Everard, seconded by Councillor Chapman. Are there any speakers? I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Item 15.3, the Enterprise Management System Procurement, moved by Councillor Mattern, seconded by Councillor Everard. Are there any speakers? Put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Item 15.4, pages 720 to 767, moved by Councillor Truscott, seconded by Councillor Sanderson. Are there any speakers? I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? It's carried unanimously. Item 16.2, pages 891 to 1147. This is moved by Councillor Chapman, seconded by Councillor Everard.
No, there's an amendment.
That's the hard debate, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Why did you leave?
I thought the hospice was coming.
No, it'll be last. It'll be. Yeah, we're going through. You've moved this current one. Yeah. This is the Fraser Coast. This is the Harvey Bay CBD.
Yep.
Moved by Councillor Chapman, seconded by Councillor Everard. Are there any speakers? I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Momentous one. Item 16.2.2, shortlisting for expressions of interest, Fraser Coast Admin Centre. This is moved by Councillor Truscott, seconded by Councillor Sanderson. Chloe, could you just read out the motion because it's amended from the recommendation?
So, upon receipt of tenders, the CEO is directed to provide a report that evaluates the alternative tendered sites against or in conjunction with the current site.
And that's an
So
amendment
if I
to the
could
first
just,
two clauses. Yep.
yeah, if I could just clarify that, Mr Mayor, that's in addition to the first two clauses of the officer's recommendation.
Are there any speakers, questions? I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Move to the hospice matter. Yeah. I move that council in principle, agree in principle to providing a peppercorn lease of council-owned or controlled land to the Fraser Coast Hospice Association for the purposes of building and operating a palliative care hospice, and two, direct the CEO to identify a suitable parcel of land and lease conditions for the consideration of council. That's seconded by Councillor Mattern. Are there any speakers or questions? If not, I'll put the motion. All in favour? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Do I let Dennis know? Were there any further items of business for today? If not, we didn't miss any of your reports? Any director report? No? Okay, if there's no further business, I'll close the meeting at 1:03. All right, thank you. Okay.